There comes a moment when a person realizes that it is not events themselves that exhaust them, but the way they react to those events. The problem is not the unexpected situation, not the careless remark, not the delay, not the criticism. The problem is the internal shock that arises every time something deviates from what was expected. A shock that repeats itself day after day until it becomes part of the emotional landscape. Many people live this way. They start the day relatively stable and over the course of the hours are gradually pushed out of themselves. A piece of news shifts their mood. An unnecessary comment sparks irritation. A frustrated expectation produces anxiety. By the end of the day, there is a sense of weariness even when very little was actually done. This instability is rarely questioned in depth. It is usually explained away as stress, sensitivity, or a natural consequence of modern life. But this superficial explanation hides something more uncomfortable: emotional dependence on circumstances. When the inner state fluctuates according to the environment, the person no longer governs their own mind. They begin to be governed by stimuli. Big or small, it makes no difference. Anything external gains the power to decide how they feel, how they react, how they live that moment. The psychological root of this problem begins early. From a very young age, we are taught to react. React to praise, react to criticism, react to approval, react to rejection. Few are taught to observe before reacting. Few are taught to sustain an inner state that does not depend on external validation or opposition. Over time, this pattern hardens. Reaction begins to feel inevitable, almost automatic. The person believes they don't have thick skin, that they can't stay calm, that this is just how they are. These phrases function as justifications that block a more honest examination of one's own posture. Stoicism looks at this differently. For the Stoics, there is no virtue in impulsive reaction. There is no merit in being swept away. True strength lies in keeping reason steady even when circumstances change. Epictetus was direct in stating that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we make about them. This idea sounds simple, but it carries a deep demand. If suffering arises from judgment, then tranquility depends on the ability to examine that judgment before accepting it. The problem is that most people never examine it. They simply accept it. The emotion appears, the thought follows, the reaction happens. Quickly, in sequence. There is no pause, no conscious choice, only habit. This habit creates a constant sense of vulnerability. The person feels exposed to the world. Anything can affect them. Anyone can throw them off balance. And in an attempt to protect themselves, they react even more. They defend themselves, they explain, they attack, they complain. All of this in the hope of regaining equilibrium. But equilibrium never comes. Because balance cannot be restored by trying to control what does not depend on us. Practical psychology shows that the more someone tries to control the environment in order to feel okay, the more internally fragile they become. Each failed attempt reinforces the idea that the world is threatening, and the mind enters a permanent state of alert. The body follows: muscle tension, shallow breathing, difficulty resting, vigilance becomes chronic. Even in neutral moments, the person feels that something could go wrong at any second. Stoicism calls this a reactive life, a life in which one does not choose how to respond, but simply responds, where reason arrives too late, after the emotional damage has already been done. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about the need to preserve the inner fortress, not allowing any event to pass through the spirit without permission. Not because the world was cruel, but because the mind needed to be governed. Governing the mind, however, is not about suppressing emotions. It is about understanding them before they become tyrants. It is about recognizing that the first impulse is not an order. It is just a signal. A signal that can be accepted or not. Suffering that arises from external circumstances is often interpreted as inevitable. Who wouldn't get irritated by that? Anyone would feel this way. These phrases normalize the loss of control. They turn reaction into destiny. Stoicism does not accept this resignation. It affirms that between an event and the disturbance it causes, there is always a space. Sometimes small, almost invisible, but real. and it is in that space that freedom begins. The difficulty is that living in that space requires training. It requires attention. It requires a willingness to endure the initial discomfort of not reacting the way one always has. Many avoid this because they confuse calm with passivity. They believe that if they do not react, they are being weak, permissive, or complicit. But this is a common confusion. Not reacting impulsively does not mean accepting everything. It means choosing the moment and the manner of action. A person who is affected by everything loses clarity, and without clarity any action tends to be disproportionate, either too aggressive or too submissive, rarely just. Stoicism seeks the right measure, not indifference, but stability, not coldness, but emotional sobriety. The challenge lies in recognizing how conditioned we are. Many believe they are free because they make external choices, but internally, they react the same way every time, the same irritations, the same wounds, the same resentments. Life changes, but the reaction remains. This repetition is the clearest sign that something is not being consciously governed. When different situations produce the same internal disturbance, the problem is not in the situations. Even so, recognizing this does not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it creates discomfort, because it shifts responsibility. The focus moves away from the world and turns inward. It is easier to blame circumstances, more comfortable to believe the problem is always outside. Stoicism breaks with this comfort. It asserts that as long as the mind does not assume its role, tranquility will always be fragile. But for many, this claim still feels abstract. It sounds good, but distant. How can one live without being affected? How can one remain calm when everything provokes? How can one avoid being shaken by loss, injustice, frustration? These questions arise early and are often dismissed quickly with the thought, "This isn't for me," that only very special people can do this, that it is unrealistic. Stoicism does not promise emotional immunity. It does not promise that nothing will be felt. It promises something more demanding, that nothing needs to dominate reason. There is a profound difference between feeling and being governed by feeling, between noticing an emotion and obeying it. This difference is rarely taught, and without it, life becomes a sequence of reactions. Initial awareness begins when one perceives the cost of this reactivity, the cost in energy, in relationships, in poor decisions, in sleepless nights, in the constant sense of being at the mercy of the world. This cost is usually ignored until it becomes too heavy, until the person realizes that they are exhausted not by what they do, but by what they repeatedly feel, by the same recycled emotions, by the same internal conflicts reactivated again and again. At that point, something begins to move. Not a clear solution, but an unease. The suspicion that perhaps it is possible to live differently, that perhaps tranquility does not depend on controlling the world, but on reorganizing the mind itself. This suspicion is still fragile. It clashes with old habits, ingrained beliefs, and the idea that reacting is natural and inevitable. But it does not disappear easily. It returns every time the person notices themselves reacting again, suffering again, losing their center again. It returns as a silent question. Does this really need to affect me this much? Part 1 ends exactly here, at this point of tension, where the problem can no longer be denied, but has not yet been deeply understood, where the mind begins to distrust its own reactions, but does not yet know how to position itself differently. Nothing has been resolved. Nothing has been closed. It has only become clear that living at the mercy of circumstances carries a high cost, and that perhaps, just perhaps, there is a path where tranquility does not depend on the world behaving as we expect, but on something much more internal, something that still needs to be examined with calm, rigor, and honesty as the reflection continues to unfold. When this unease settles in, something that once went unnoticed begins to stand out. Disturbance rarely comes from major tragedies. It almost always arises from small, repeated frictions. A trivial delay, a curt reply, a look interpreted as disdain, a minor expectation that is not met. These are small events but constant ones, eroding tranquility like persistent drops of water. These episodes are not isolated. They form patterns. The same irritation in traffic, the same impatience in lines, the same sense of injustice when something deviates from the plan, the same frustration when someone does not act as expected. The setting changes, but the internal reaction repeats with remarkable regularity. Most people believe they are reacting to different situations when in fact they are repeating the same emotional movement. This creates a dangerous illusion that the world is chaotic and unpredictable, when the most predictable pattern is one's own reaction. Stoicism observes this phenomenon carefully. For it is not events that repeat, but judgments. The mind creates automatic interpretations, almost always unexamined, and reacts to them as if they were unquestionable facts. A common interpretive error is confusing sensation with truth. Feeling disrespected does not mean one was disrespected. Feeling threatened does not mean there is real danger. Feeling diminished does not mean personal worth was actually attacked. But when emotion arises, it is usually accepted as proof. Practical psychology shows that over time, this mechanism creates mental shortcuts. The mind learns to react before understanding, to anticipate before evaluating, to defend before listening. All of this happens in seconds without conscious reflection. These shortcuts were built to protect, but they end up imprisoning. Each impulsive reaction reinforces the corresponding neural pathway. And the more that pathway is used, the more automatic it becomes. The person begins to believe this is just how I am, when in reality they have simply trained this pattern for years. In daily life, this manifests almost invisibly. A neutral comment is interpreted as criticism. A silence is interpreted as rejection. A setback is interpreted as failure. The interpretation is loaded with personal meaning, even when the event itself is impersonal. Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But imagination, when unobserved, comes to command emotional life. The person reacts not to what happens, but to what they believe it means about them. Another recurring pattern is the expectation of control. Many people believe, often unconsciously, that tranquility depends on the world functioning according to plan. When it does not, frustration arises, and that frustration is experienced as something unjust, almost offensive. The problem is not planning, but attachment. Attachment turns any unforeseen event into a threat, and the mind, feeling threatened, reacts. Epictetus insisted that misplaced desire is one of the greatest sources of suffering. Wanting the world to be different from what it is, wanting people to act according to our expectations, wanting circumstances to obey our will. All of this creates a constant tension between reality and expectation. This tension is rarely recognized. The person feels only the result: irritation, anxiety, impatience, and they try to resolve it by changing the exterior. They complain, argue, demand, control. But the pattern repeats because the source has not been touched. Another common error is believing that calm depends on ideal conditions. When this is resolved, I'll be calm. When that person changes, I'll feel better. When everything is in order, I'll rest. This postponement creates a life that is always provisional. Peace is placed in the future, never in the present. Stoicism sees this as a trap, because the future offers no guarantees, and anyone who conditions tranquility on something external will always find a reason to be disturbed. Over time, these repeated reactions produce deep emotional consequences. The person becomes more rigid, less tolerant, more tired. Small problems seem large. Minor frustrations accumulate. The mind lives in a state of readiness, waiting for the next shock. This affects the quality of relationships. Arguments arise over details. Patience diminishes. Dialogue becomes defensive. The person begins to feel misunderstood, when in fact they are reacting to unexamined internal interpretations. The body feels it too. Constant tension, difficulty relaxing, shallow sleep. The emotional state does not resolve at night because the mind continues to ruminate on the day's events. Tranquility always seems distant, Stoicism does not interpret this as weakness of character, but as a lack of internal training. No one is born knowing how to distinguish between what happens and what one thinks about what happens. This distinction must be cultivated. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if something external disturbs you, it is not the thing itself that affects you, but the judgment you make about it, and that judgment can be revoked. But to be revoked, it must first be noticed. Here an important point emerges. Most people live so identified with their thoughts that they do not perceive them as thoughts. They are experienced as reality. Questioning them feels strange, almost artificial. Yet this is exactly what Stoicism proposes: to question before consenting. Until that happens, the patterns continue to repeat. The same irritation in different contexts, the same anxiety in the face of uncertainty, the same difficulty accepting what cannot be changed. External life changes, but internal experience remains the same. This repetition is the clearest sign that something needs to be reconsidered, not in the world, but in the way one relates to it. Even so, noticing the patterns does not mean knowing what to do with them. Awareness begins to expand, but no new posture has yet been established. There is only the uncomfortable clarity that tranquility is being constantly handed over to external factors. This clarity generates resistance. The mind tries to defend itself. It looks for exceptions, for justifications, for specific circumstances to blame. But little by little, it becomes difficult to ignore the regularity of the problem. The question begins to gain strength. Why do such small things throw me so far off balance? Why does my peace feel so fragile? Why do I react as if everything were personal? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They simply remain, gently pressing on awareness. Because something is becoming clear, living this way is not inevitable, but it is also not simple to change. Part 2 ends at this point of deepening. Where patterns have been seen, interpretive errors have begun to be recognized, and the long-term emotional consequences have become evident. But there is still no turning point, no complete reframing yet. There is only the growing perception that the mind has handed over too much power to what happens outside, and that as long as this continues, any attempt at tranquility will be unstable. Something must change in the way control, reaction, and inner responsibility are understood. That change has not yet been clearly formulated, but it is approaching. Because when patterns become visible, reason begins to demand another way of operating, less reactive, less dependent, more lucid. A way that still needs to be revealed more fully, as reflection advances to the point where awareness ceases merely to observe the problem and begins to question, more firmly, where exactly the fundamental error lies that keeps the mind hostage to circumstances. At this point, most people fail decisively, not because of a lack of intelligence or sensitivity, but because they seek solutions on the same level where the problem was created. They try to change the world, adjust people, control outcomes, avoid situations. All of this seems reasonable, but it leaves the core of dependency intact. The error is not in what happens, it is in where control is placed. As long as tranquility is treated as something that comes from outside, it will always be unstable. As long as one's inner state depends on other people's behavior, on chance, or on circumstances, the mind will remain vulnerable. This realization is hard because it dismantles the hope that one day everything will be in order, enough for peace to finally exist. Stoicism breaks with this expectation. It asserts something simple and uncomfortable. Tranquility is not the consequence of a favorable world, but of a well-governed mind. Here the shift in awareness occurs. This is not about denying emotions. It is not about pretending indifference. It is about restoring reason to its place of command. Most people live with reason reacting to emotions when it should be the other way around. Emotion arises. It always will. That is human. The error begins when it is granted immediate authority, when the first impulse is treated as truth, when a sensation is confused with a fact. Short phrases begin to assert themselves internally, not as comfort, but as criteria. This happened outside, not inside. This is an impression, not a verdict. I can feel without obeying. These phrases do not eliminate discomfort, but they put it in its proper place. Emotion ceases to own the house and becomes a visitor. Most people err because they believe self-control is repression, that holding back a reaction is denying oneself. Stoicism shows the opposite. Reacting impulsively is not authenticity, it is conditioning. True authenticity requires conscious choice. Epictetus taught that assent is the decisive point. Between what happens and the disturbance lies the moment when the mind agrees with an interpretation. This moment usually goes unnoticed, but it is where everything is decided. When someone speaks sharply, an impression arises. When something goes wrong, an impression arises. When an expectation is frustrated, an impression arises. None of this can be prevented. What can be prevented is immediate consent. The shift in awareness happens when one learns to suspend that consent, not to analyze everything excessively, but to avoid automatic surrender. That interval changes everything. At first, it is uncomfortable. The mind wants to react as it always has. It wants to relieve tension with a quick response. It wants to restore the feeling of control. But reason, now more attentive, observes and holds. It holds not through rigidity, but through clarity. Here an essential reframing enters. Control is not controlling the world. Control is controlling what one accepts as internal truth. The world will remain unpredictable. People will continue to fail. Circumstances will continue to change. Expecting otherwise is illusion. Tranquility begins when this instability is accepted without handing one's own stability over to it. Most people live trying to expel discomfort. The Stoic learns to endure it without dramatizing, to remain in the midst of inner turbulence without identifying with it. This requires limits, internal limits, not external ones. Up to here, this enters. Beyond this, it does not. Up to here, this situation deserves my attention. Beyond this, it does not deserve my peace. These limits are not announced to the world. They are sustained in silence. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that not everything needs to affect you. Not everything needs to be taken inside. The mind has the right, and the duty, to select. The shift in awareness also reveals another common error. The belief that calm means the absence of conflict. It does not. It means the presence of criteria. It means not losing oneself in conflict. A person can act, can correct, can take a stand, but does so without surrendering emotional control, without allowing action to be dictated by irritation or fear. Here, silent insights emerge, almost disconcerting. Not everything needs to be resolved now. Not every injustice demands immediate reaction. Not every provocation deserves a response. These insights do not make a person passive. They make them strategic. They make them lucid. Most people err because they confuse speed with effectiveness. Reacting quickly gives the sensation of power. But most of the time, it only amplifies the problem. Action guided by reason is slower but more precise. At this stage, the relationship with discomfort changes. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes an indicator, indicating where attachment still exists, where expectations are misplaced, where there is still a desire to control the uncontrollable. Reason begins to ask firmly, does this depend on me? If it does not, why am I handing my peace over to it? This question does not seek an emotional answer, it seeks alignment. The shift in awareness does not eliminate external stimuli, it eliminates their tyranny. One begins to feel without becoming disorganized, to perceive without dissolving, to live in the world without being dragged by it. At first, this stage brings a strange sensation, a mix of sobriety and freedom. The mind feels less excited but more stable, less dramatic but stronger. Some interpret this as a loss of intensity. In truth, it is a gain in depth. Life ceases to be an emotional roller coaster and acquires an axis. That axis is trained reason. Even so, this understanding is not the end. It prepares something greater. Because understanding where the error lies is not enough. It must be translated into daily practice, into repeated choices, into simple attitudes. Awareness is now ready for the next step. No longer merely observing and reframing, but applying. Applying in thoughts, in emotions, in conversations, in silent boundaries. Something essential is about to consolidate. Tranquility ceases to be a distant idea and begins to present itself as a concrete possibility, not because the world has changed, but because the mind is about to assume, definitively, responsibility for its own inner state. This responsibility is not light, but it is liberating. And it is from this point that final clarity begins to take shape, when Stoicism ceases to be merely intellectual understanding and becomes a daily posture, firm enough that external circumstances gradually lose the power to throw someone off balance, even as they continue to happen exactly as they always have. It is not the absence of problems that transforms one's relationship with life. It is the end of inner submission. When the mind understands once and for all that external circumstances do not have direct access to reason, something stabilizes, not as euphoria, nor as fleeting enthusiasm, but as quiet firmness. A firmness that does not depend on the situation, on other people's reactions, or on the order of events. Stoicism never promised a life without adversity. It promised something rarer, a mind that does not fall apart in the face of it. At this point, tranquility stops being a passing emotional state and becomes a posture sustained by clear boundaries. Boundaries between what is perceived and what is accepted, between what happens outside and what is allowed to happen inside. Practical application begins in a simple, almost discreet way. In thoughts, the first movement is calm vigilance. Thoughts arise as they always have. Automatic judgments appear. Quick interpretations try to impose themselves. The difference now is that they no longer receive immediate approval. They are observed before being adopted. When something happens and the thought says, "This is unbearable," reason intervenes. Is it unpleasant, or is it unbearable? When the thought says, "This is personal," reason asks, "Is there evidence of that, or is it just an interpretation?" This inner dialogue is not conflict. It is governance. The mind stops being a stage and becomes a place of decision. With emotions, the practice requires maturity. Emotions are not pushed away. They are welcomed without being blindly obeyed. Irritation may arise, but it does not lead the conversation. Anxiety may appear, but it does not dictate action. Frustration may be felt, but it does not dominate the day. Feeling ceases to be synonymous with reacting. This distinction is one of the greatest sources of inner freedom, because it prevents momentary emotional states from determining actions with lasting consequences. In conversations, the application becomes visible. One begins to respond less by impulse and more by criteria. Not everything needs to be said. Not every disagreement needs to be defended. Not every provocation needs to be confronted. Silence stops being uncomfortable and becomes a tool for balance. Many tensions dissolve simply because they find no emotional buy-in. Silent boundaries take shape here. They are not imposed harshly, but sustained through consistency. Up to here, this involves me. Beyond this, it does not. Not because the other person changed, but because reason decided. These boundaries preserve energy. They protect emotional dignity. They prevent unnecessary exposure. And over time, they profoundly change the dynamics of relationships. In daily life, application shows up in small, repeated choices, not ruminating on what is already past, not anticipating what cannot be controlled, not dramatizing what can be managed, not trading inner peace for momentary relief. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the mind has the power to retreat inward whenever it wishes, not to escape the world, but to reorganize before acting within it. This retreat is not isolation. It is strategic withdrawal. The final reflection is firm and honest. It was never the world that threw you off balance. It was the unexamined internal consents, the interpretations accepted without criteria, the expectations placed where there was no control. Owning this does not create guilt. It creates responsibility, and responsibility is the beginning of freedom. When the mind learns to distinguish between what depends on itself and what does not, something changes permanently. Circumstances remain external. People remain imperfect. Life remains uncertain. But the center stays stable. Tranquility stops being fragile because it is no longer supported by unstable factors. If this reflection brought clarity, it is worth continuing to cultivate this state of attention. Subscribing to the channel is simply a calm way to keep practicing reason. Liking the video helps this kind of content continue to exist. And commenting, if it feels right, is a simple way to register what has changed and how you react to the world.